All right, it's showtime.
Let's
Anyways,
go.
welcome everyone to another episode of Everything Outside Code. And today I'm super pumped because I'm speaking to Ivan Burazin, the co-founder of
Perfect.
Daytona. I hope I got that right. The
Perfect.
co-founder
Perfect.
of Daytona. If you haven't seen Daytona like I have, they're shipping like crazy. But we're gonna get into Daytona in a bit, so I don't like go off course. But if you're listening to this, feel free to leave comments in comment section wherever, either on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitter. Today we're going to be talking about developer experience, everything that cuts across building a great DX. What does a great developer experience mean? How do you go from 0 to 1 as a founder? We're going to also talk about open source software. We can talk about content and documentation, and typically we're just going to have a fun time. So I'm going to pass it on to the man of the moment, Ivan. And you could just introduce yourself and give us a bit about your background, and we'll continue from there.
Sure. I mean, real quick, thanks for having me, William. Great to be here. Background, just a tech person, I guess, working for developers more than anything else. So Daytona, co-founded Daytona, which is a dev environment management platform, originally
Mhm.
created for the enterprise. What does that mean? Dev environment management. Well, basically, there's three people we bring value to. One is the developer. So it's basically one button. It sets up everything. It just works. You don't have to think about it. Some people joke that it's like a wrapper
Mhm.
around Docker. Basically, you don't have to go through README. It just like automatically everything works. And it turns your dev environment into preview environment automatically. So you can, as you work, you can share with people what you're doing. The
Okay.
second value is for the DevOps. So we take care of all the orchestration, all the Docker containers, everything, just make sure it works. And if something breaks, the developer can make a new one. They don't have to call the DevOps team. Or if the DevOps team is giving you EC2s or droplets to work on, you don't have to call them for that. Like Daytona just manages it, spins it up and down. And the last thing is for like SecOps, security people. There's like all the audit logging, all making sure the source code is at one place, locking in where the code from GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket can be accessed. You can say
Mhm.
you can't access from your laptop. You can only access it from a dev environment that's run by Daytona, which is securely behind our firewall. So basically, Daytona makes developers' lives easier, but also DevOps and SecOps people as well. Before that, I ran a conference called Shift. So it's about 4,000 people. It still exists, and it was acquired by a company called Infobip. I was there for 2.5 years before I moved on to Daytona. And before the Shift conference, I founded a company called Code Anywhere, which is the very first browser-based IDE back in 2009. So super, super early. And that's sort of the precursor to Daytona. So Daytona is like finishing that vision we started a long time ago. And before that, just did a bunch of crazy things and some very boring things. But yeah,
Mhm.
been at it for quite a while. Yeah.
Yeah, I see since 2004, 2006
Long
as a
time. It's a long time.
consultant. Yeah,
Long time.
it's
Long time.
yeah, it's
I'm
been a long
getting
time. I think
old. I'm getting old. Yeah.
I don't think so. All right. I think you covered quite a bit of things here that I'd love to touch upon. And I think the closest, or at least the first one of the first things you mentioned is how Daytona is sort of like a successor to Code Anywhere. Is How is Daytona different from a browser-based IDE? Just
So sure.
that's a
Yeah. Happy to.
dumb question, but
Yeah.
how is
No, no,
how is
no,
it different?
absolutely. So the way I look at it, when we created this browser-based IDE, unlike, Google Docs or whatnot, where you have a browser-based text editor, the text editor is just
Hmm.
like the front end, right? There's no back end there. You're just typing text. It's all rendered in the front end. It just saves something, right?
Hmm.
But to create a browser-based IDE that works, you actually have to have a runtime underneath. Like you actually have to be able to check
Yeah.
out the code, run the code, and do all these things. And so to do these things, to create a cloud IDE, you have the front end interface and you have the underlying infrastructure, right? And those are two different parts. And they both have to come in a package to offer a cloud ID. But Daytona is not a cloud ID. It's just the infra layer. Why is it just the infra layer? Well, the vast majority of developers now want to use, or always want to use, what they already like to use, which is VS Code or WebStorm or Cursor or whatever IDE. And Daytona lets developers use their local IDE while their dev environment can be locally or remotely. So you as a developer don't feel a different experience, or at least a negative experience. It is essentially the same or better, because we manage everything in the back end, but the interface that you had is the same. So that's why we say it's not a cloud ID, because there is no cloud ID there. You use the ID
Yeah.
you're accustomed to.
Yeah. This is interesting. So I'm trying to get to why should a developer care about Daytona? So what's the problem here Daytona is trying to solve?
Sure, for individual developers, and so we have again the open source and the enterprise. The open source is not the entire product; it is just the value to the developer.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what is that value to the developer? Well, I mean, if you're doing a front end app, just like you could even do it on your local, like you don't particularly, for the most part, you might not care. There are some valuable things in there, but we're talking about if you have like more complex dev environments that there's a long README, you have to figure it out, have to install all these dependencies. It takes a lot of compute from your machine. You sometimes, I mean, I know when I'm sometimes working and then Docker kills my video calls. Like I was literally doing a podcast and it was glitching. I didn't know why. It's because my dev environment was running locally, not because I do that, but because I was testing something and I didn't turn it
Yeah.
off. I'm like, what the hell is going on? And so they're like all these sort of things and problems that you're working on to set up this dev environment. And so with Daytona, for the individual developer, the open source is completely free. We will never make money off this. It is an automation tool, basically. So you type in Daytona
Okay.
create and you point to your repository that you're working on. And so what Daytona will do, you point to two things. You point to the repository you're working on, and
Mm-hmm.
you point to where you want to run it. So you want to run on your local machine or on DigitalOcean or AWS, wherever you want. And so what Daytona will do, it will check out that repo, or essentially it will spin up a Docker container if it's local, or multiple of them.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you point to AWS, it'll spin up an EC2 and then the containers inside of that. So it'll
Yeah.
orchestrate all, it'll check out the code. If it has a configuration file, so think dev container or Nix or dev file, there's what we call builders. So they will build that entire dev environment for you. Once that building is done, it will connect to the local ID that you choose. So yeah, that's the third thing you choose. So your cursor, your VS Code, or whatever, it will connect to that on your local machine. It will exchange SSH keys automatically, so you don't have to worry about that. It will
Mm-hmm.
open it up. It will also proxy everything to localhost. So if it's on localhost, obviously it's running. You open your browser for previous localhost. But even if you're running on an EC2, it will work on localhost. So we take care of that. So you don't think about IP addresses. You don't care where that is. It's always the same experience, local remote. And it adds a reverse proxy, meaning it will add a URL like xyz try-daytona.io as a preview from that EC2 or even from your local machine. So my laptop right now, which is like
Mm-hmm.
on a whatever internet optical internet at home,
Mm-hmm.
I can share a URL with you and you can see the product. Like you don't have to
Yeah.
go to staging. No one has to commit to that. Like you can see it instantaneously, which gives a really good feedback loop if you're working in a team or working with marketing or whatever. And so these little paper cuts that you all have to do when you're setting up a dev environment, Daytona does that automatically. And we've
Yeah.
even timed this, like if you really know what you're doing, like off by heart, you spin this dev environment multiple times, it will take you like
Mm-hmm.
15 minutes to get up and running. If you're newer, it'll take you like 45 or longer. With Daytona, it's like 45 seconds. So it costs you zero money. It is the user experience is the same, only better, and it does everything faster. And so that's why that is the value that we bring with Daytona to the individual developer.
Yeah. That's amazing. And you say this is open source.
Yep.
At least the open source version is suitable for developers, because I see the larger problem here seems to be more suited to enterprise companies that have to manage like number of teams, different like features and teams building things in parallel.
Yeah, so this is for the individual developer. The enterprise product is layered on top of that open source, which we
Mm-hmm.
create all the orchestration and all the security tooling. Like for large companies, it's a
Mm-hmm.
lot about, who has access to what, and sort of like,
Yeah.
can they access that? Can't they? Logs later on if something goes bad, compliance. Those are the things that very large companies are interested in, especially because if you're working on your local machine and inside a Docker container, that's basically a black box. Like they don't know what's happening. And I'm not
What's
saying
happening?
that they're being Uncle Sam and like looking like what you're doing and checking whatever, but it's more like post event if something happens that they can look back and actually see. And they do this
Yeah.
for everything on your machine anyway, but they can't do it for dev environments. And so that is something, obviously developers don't like this, but it's happening on their Slack, their email, their everything anyway. And source code is something that is not done there. So if we as Daytona can give security people that observability,
Mm-hmm.
but give a better experience to developers, I think it's a good trade-off between the two.
Yeah. So I just put it out here for anyone looking to check out Daytona. Just go to daytona.io and give it a try. And the team is shipping like crazy. So be sure to check back tomorrow for whatever else they've
For an
shipped
update,
recently.
yeah.
for an update for sure. The other thing you mentioned that I'm really fascinated by is that Infobip acquired Shift, which is a conference.
Yep.
How'd you acquire a conference?
So, I mean,
Is that
conferences are
possible?
businesses. Conferences are
Okay.
actually businesses. Like if you look at Money 2020, which is a big financial fintech conference, it was acquired for $100 million. Like this is $100 million. So that is like if a startup's acquired for 100 million, that's a lot, right? And startups are like software and they're scalable and they're like blah, blah, blah. But you wouldn't think that conferences, and I got in conferences by accident. Conferences have a different gross margin. So like a SaaS company is like a 80, 90 something percent gross profit margin, which is awesome. Conferences are not so much. They are about a 35, 45%, but it's not terrible, right? It's not a terrible margin and you can scale these conferences. So if you look at, Web Summit, which is like, I think 120,000 people now come to Lisbon, like they make real money. Like it is a cash cow when you get to that scale of things. And so I did it for about 10 years. The first 3 years we lost money. Like I didn't know you can make money. And then you sort of learn as you go on. And the interesting thing with conferences is that you also learn how to sell to both businesses and individuals. So you have the B2B element and the B2C, because the sponsors are B2B. Like there's marketing budget and you're selling it to people in larger companies, someone in Microsoft or Docker or, Red Hat or whatever. And then you have the individuals, like will a developer swipe his credit card and buy, a couple $100 ticket, or will his boss, her boss, do that. And so you're selling to both of these at the same time. But I was telling someone the other day, also on a podcast, I think in the top 10 most stressful jobs in the world, like there's like firefighters, which is like, of course, like, yes, we need firefighters, but like conference organizers, you would not expect that. But if you like been there, it is a very, very, very stressful job, and obviously not as needed as firefighters. I'm not trying to say that, right? But it is a very, very stressful job and something that I did very well, but I didn't want to do anymore. So to answer your question, I was looking to get back. I was looking to get back into actual startup land and be a founder of a startup, because I had not finished what I had planned with Code Anywhere. And this had already grown to an actual business. Like we had full-time employees. We're doing 3 conferences a year. Like we had, thousands of people coming to this thing. We've expanded to like 3 cities and 2 countries. And so it's like you can't just turn it off. It doesn't make sense. And we were talking about this earlier, people in Norway live very well. Well, like building that conference, I lived pretty well. It was like a pretty good life there. And so I looked for an opportunity to do that. And Infobip, just for the people that don't know, it is a communications platform as a service company, meaning they have an API for sending SMS, email, WhatsApp, whatever, similar to Twilio, right? And Twilio at that time was doing like 2 billion, something like that, ARR, and a public company. Infobip was doing 1 billion ARR, and a private company, but they were doing exclusively B2B and they had no B2C, should I say product-led growth. And that
was
is
all
looking at
sales-led.
developers. It's all developer. It was all salespeople. There was no like bottom up.
Wow.
And bottom up is developers. And I met the founders at one point and they're like, developers, like we need developers. And that's sort of like the beginning of the conversation. And over the course of like a year and a half, we worked together, we consulted, they sponsored the conference. And at what time it was just like basically, yo, like just come work for us. We'll buy that thing for you, and you can have that conference will be ours. And so
Yeah.
Twilio has their Signal, AWS has reInvent, GitHub has
Mhm.
Universe, and now Infobip has Shift. And so that's their conference. That now, I mean, it has grown 2.5 fold since
Yeah.
since it has been acquired. It's been going really well.
Yeah. I have my buddies flying out to Croatia like in the summer. Like, is it
Yeah.
in the summer? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, in the
it's
summer.
end of summer. There's also one in
Yeah.
Miami now as well. So just so you know.
Oh, okay. I just know they fly out to Zadar
Yeah, Zada. Yeah,
sometime in the summer. I'm like, oh my god, I wish I could just head out there at some point. But
there's
yeah,
like cheap
it's
flights. It's
been
like $100 flight from like Oslo to Zada or something like that. So yeah,
yeah, it's just finding the time to
exactly.
actually go there. Well, I'll look out for the next one. So I'm curious with I mean, this all sounds too amazing with the conference. I know operationally conference is sort of like a headache, but how do you keep the consistency? What is like the one thing you've done over the years with the conferences that just helps it grow? Because I've seen a number of conferences and I've been a part of them. They grow for the first like 2, 3 years and then they just like die out, they fizzle out. So what have you done to like keep this? Because you have to keep both the sponsors happy and then the attendees and the developers and all the
Yeah, you
partners
have to
happy.
keep everyone happy. It's a very tricky thing if you don't understand human psychology, which I kind of think I'm like not a psychologist by any means, but like just maybe more empathic and trying to figure things out.
Hmm.
So the way I look at conferences is it is essentially it's like a concert. So you have a show, a front runner, right? Bands,
Yeah.
whatever. And those are your speakers, right? They are the people that will bring everyone there. Even though I'm a strong believer, when I go to conferences, I never listen to the talks. Like never. Like I don't think there's a point to it. I can watch
Same.
it on YouTube. Like I'm there to meet
Yeah.
the people. But people do go for that. And the front runners are like why people like I'm going to the conference because XYZ is speaking there, and that means it's a great conference. So what
Hmm.
does that mean? That means that you have to take very, very, very good care of these people. And I'm not talking about like, for the most part, I don't think Shift ever paid like a speaker fees or something like that. We never did. Like you have some speakers that ask for like $100,000 to speak. Like we didn't have those budgets. Like if we wanted to, we
Really?
couldn't. Yeah, no, like 100 is like easy. There's a lot in the $40,000-$50,000 range. So you can be a speaker and
Yeah.
make good as well. And so what we tried to find was like the speakers that we looked for were speakers that don't make a living off of talking, but actually have an actual business.
Hmm.
And this is a way to, travel, meet people, express and talk about what they're doing. Right. And so
Yeah.
you find those people. And when you bring them, you just take really good care of them. And that just means like make sure someone picks them up at the airport. Make sure you like pay for a room for them. Like that's the least you can do. Like I've gone to conferences where they pay you nothing, just to have like you go there and speak. But if you get them a nice room, I'm talking nice, we're not talking about like the Ritz Carlton, Four Seasons,
Yeah.
like 4 or 5 star hotel, really nice. It has like a pool, a gym, a sauna, whatever.
Hmm.
Like it's a nice place. You feel nice.
Yeah.
And you have someone pick them up. It doesn't even have to be a limo. Like it just could be like a car. Just someone picks them up and takes care of them, takes care of their worries.
Hmm.
And then all the speakers are in one place. And so they can interact with each other because they're all in that same place. And then they meet
Yeah.
other people. And they're really, so I know a bunch of people that are speakers. They're super well known. Like they sold their company for like $1 billion, and they met friends at Shift, right? Like they've met other people from San Francisco or New York or, London
Yeah.
or whatever. And they met them there because they were all in the same, not room, sorry, all in the same hotel, all in the same place. And you organize like
Yeah.
dinners for them, which are like stand-up dinners. There's also a psychology people. When I do this, I always do stand-up dinners, not sit down. What that means is there's no chairs, just like tall tables.
Okay.
The reason you do that is because when people sit down, it's very hard to interact with anyone except for the two people
Else.
left and right of you and
Yeah.
the one person across from you. And if you do stand-ups and let's say, and you have to go and pick up the food, what happens is you have to like figure out who you're going to like squeeze by so you can eat.
Yeah.
It's slightly uncomfortable, but it makes you meet other people. And if you don't
Yeah.
like the people or you're like looking to talk to others, you just say, oh, I'm just going to go grab some food. And then when you go grab some food, you actually end up at another table. And there's like so much more serendipitous meeting of these people together
Hmm.
that they end up, making these connections, and the connections are what is worth it. And so you drive them, like when it ends, you like have someone drives them back to the airport, they get on their plane and they're out. And just that is like half of the battle that you have to do. And in the sense of like with speakers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And everyone will say like, you're a great host, we liked it, and they'll talk about really, really well with you. The next thing that I have to say is the production quality of your conference has to go up every year. So if your stage was X big and you had X amount of lights and X amount of lasers or whatever it was, there has to be more next time. It doesn't matter if it's like 10% more or 2x
Mm-hmm.
more, it has to be more. Otherwise, it starts, so people start like talking, oh, are they like falling apart? Are things bad and whatnot? And so
Yeah.
you have to add those things. And I think if you have those two things, everything else works itself out. And even the
Yeah.
sponsors, like when we went to pitch sponsors when we were not well known, like no popular company ever, like no major brand ever said yes. It was just like smaller local ones, cheaper, whatever. But when the big brands see the great speakers, and because speakers talk to themselves, they all know each other, you get better and better and better
Mm-hmm.
and better speakers because they send you speakers, right? Like they send you, oh, you have to go to this conference because it's super awesome, because Ivan like has a great time and like they take care of you and
Yeah.
whatever. And then because of that, then the sponsors come in, and then when the sponsors come in, then other sponsors come in, and it takes a while. It's not a 1 year thing. It takes a while. But I say that is, so it's one, take really good care of your speakers. The second, obviously you have to take care of your sponsors, but make sure the production quality goes up every year. Those are
Yeah.
the, without doing like a 2 hour, like how to set up a conference sort of talk, like those would be
Mm-hmm.
my two things.
Yeah. If I was going to pick one thing, it would be take care of the speakers.
For sure. Take care of
100%.
speakers.
Yeah. Just
100%.
the speaker
Yeah.
experience should be fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you very much. I mean, we organize a summit. I think we still call it a summit here in Oslo. It's an AI summit for the fastest growing AI meetup here. And the last one was fantastic. But I don't know if we did as much to take care of the speakers, because it was sort of like the speakers were coming to give back to the community. So we just focused on the story we're telling and the attendees. But this is just important to think about the fact that if we want to grow this next time, grow it the next time, when you think about speakers, and then the production quality definitely needs to go up. We had something good this year, so I'm interested in how we're going to beat that next year. But thanks for that.
Absolutely. For sure.
I love to talk about developer experience, which is, I think we've just been talking about developer enablement
Yeah.
for the first part. I like to see it. But what's your take on developer experience? What does great developer experience look like?
I mean, there's so many things. I'm very much, we didn't talk about that at a conference, but like even the speaker's experience and the production quality's experience and how to, a ticket looks and how you book it, all that experience. But like usually with I also split developer experience between internal and external. So what does
Mm-hmm.
that mean in the sense of internal developer experience? Well, if I'm an engineer at Stripe or I'm an engineer at like Ericsson or whatever, like what does my day look like? What are tools I have to use? What is in my way to actually create? Like what is blocking me
Mm-hmm.
or stopping me, or how great is that experience? On the flip side, we also talk about external developer experience, meaning like you are a dev tool, an API, whatever. It's like, how long does it take me as a consumer developer get to time to first value, right? Like how long does it take me
Mm-hmm.
like to get your API, and in the case of like Infobip, send an SMS, or in the sense
Mm-hmm.
of Daytona, how long does it take me from, oh, this is Daytona, to getting a dev environment up and running? Like how
Mm-hmm.
long is that? And that is everything from, the website, the documentation, the CLI, SDKs, like depending on what you are, like, does that stuff even, we were talking about this, does it even exist, is like
Mm-hmm.
one. And then the second is like, now that exists, how well is that thought out, right?
Yeah.
And so we were talking earlier about documentation, and I like have a strong opinion about documentation. That documentation is essentially product because of how much
Okay.
developers use that. And even though I'm super invested in that, and we have like our developers help with that, and we have a person working on that, I still don't feel that documentation is where it should be. Like it's still not there. It's like a moving target. And so like all the info is there, but the way the info is structured, it is actually really, really hard. I think it's easier if you have an API, which you can like generate like a general reference and then you work around that.
Yeah.
But if you're creating like product documentation, when something exists, it's easier to like, oh, there's a new feature, and then you slap on the new feature in the docs because there's a structure. But when you're blank, like the product just was created, like how do we
Yeah.
structure this? Like, is it like who is it talking to? Because it can talk to multiple users, like the DevOps that's installing it, the developer that's using it, the security person that wants the logs, like, and how like
Mm-hmm.
is it someone that's already using it? Is it installed at one? Like, how do you structure all these things? And I think that there's no like right or wrong. We know what is good documentation when we see it. So like Stripe is
Mm-hmm.
obviously a great one. I like Supabase's docs. They're like really big, but I still like them quite a bit. And so like I think that is around developer experience. Sorry, I digressed a bit, but like I just have a thing about documentation and want it to be really good. And I think it's much harder than people think it is when they get out. And that's why probably people respect it when it is really good.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I mean, at Hackmamba, I struggle every day to tell people, founders, that great documentation is good. You need it. But they're usually not so sure. They're like, yeah, we're just going to keep building. It's not really
Building, yeah.
top priority for us. The documentation experience isn't, we're going to deal with it later. And especially at the start, which is something I want to get your take on. I talk to founders and they're like, they want to focus on building. The documentation for what they've built, that's an afterthought. That's something they'll deal with later. And by later, this isn't next week or next quarter. This is like
never, yeah.
this is always like when we have a lot of users that this becomes like a very serious problem, then we'll figure out how to deal with it. So I wanted to get your take on that. Should documentation be something teams care about from the get-go? Do they lay like the foundation for it? Maybe think about the structure or the developer journey first. These things, from my experience, take a couple of days, 1 day, 2 days, if you just think about it and
Yeah,
put
it
something in
takes
place.
it takes a bit of time, I have to tell you. And like we were guilty of that. When you look at Code Anywhere back in the day, there was no there's no documentation. We never made documentation. We existed
Yeah.
like we were a full-time company with 20 employees at one point. We had zero documentation. It's like we were just building like, oh, you should figure it out by yourself. It's like,
Yeah.
well, no, probably not. That is not how things work. And I think
Yeah.
like most technical founders, especially, they don't have this struggle even today. It's not even just documentation. It is when we think about like when we're building Daytona, when you think about product, oh, the number one thing is like
Yeah.
add this feature, like because it will be better. But the vast majority of the features that are going to make things better are UI and UX tweaks. Like that makes a bigger impact than being able to do another features. Like doing the features that you already have better or like
Yeah.
more in a way that the
Hoping the
person will be
experience
more
be
comfortable doing
better.
it, experience is better,
Yeah.
will pay more dividends than just adding a new feature. The other thing
Yeah.
is that if you're actually selling, and that's so this is a user versus buyer as well. If you're actually going to sell the thing, you're probably not selling to the developer, you're selling to the enterprise. And then if you're selling to an enterprise or a company in general, they care about so many other things. So they don't really care about the experience. As if you've ever worked in a big company, most of the software is like crap because
Yeah.
the experience is not what people are paying for. They're paying for compliance and security and automation and blah, 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 and all these things. Developers usually don't think about these things. They're like, the product has to do this thing,
These
right?
things. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's, I think documentation falls into that bucket where like documentation and experience and compliance and all that thing is like not important. It's not cool and it's not fun. We just have to make sure that if you do X, it does Y, right? Like it does the
Yeah.
thing. But that's like, that is very much half the battle. That's not even half the battle. That's like 10% part of what you need to be a successful company, all in all.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, it's interesting to hear someone else echo that. I'm not crazy. I just
No,
finally
for
heard
sure.
that.
For sure.
I'm definitely not crazy. Something you mentioned that I really liked was the split between internal developer experience and external. From your experience, when the goal is time to first value, delivering value, being able to deliver value, which of these do you feel carries more weight when the outcome is to deliver more value? Should developers just focus on, or should the team or the founder focus on helping the internal developer experience be better so they could ship the better product faster? Or do they focus on enabling external developers use whatever they've built? Which do you feel is more important, or
I
what are
think it
some of the
depends on the
factors?
size of the company. So like, I mean, and it should start small. So like when you're a startup and there's like 3 people, like there's no internal developer experience. It's like the three of us. It's like, yo,
Yeah.
this doesn't work. And then, there you go. It works now. Like there's no internal
Yeah.
developer experience. And so like we're like 16 people now. And so you're adding things slightly in there because there's more people. Not everyone's talking to everyone and you're figuring this out. And the only thing as a dev tool company, you are like working on external developer experience. And so there also, to be fair, there's companies that only have internal, they don't have external. So if you're working for, I'm trying to make this up, what company? Expedia, right? I don't think Expedia has an external developer experience. Maybe they have some API, I'm not sure. But like essentially externally, it's a user that's booking, a
Yeah.
hotel or whatever it is. And then you only have internal developers that you're thinking about, right? We, as a dev tool company, you're the few that have both internal and external dev experience. And I think the internal starts to become important when you get to a certain scale, because when you have scaled, you add complexities, there's rules, and there's all these blockers in what you're trying to do. And then what you're trying to do as developer experience. So I had recently had an interview with the team at Atlassian, so the makers of Jira and Bitbucket.
Yeah.
And they're the team that runs DevX like for Atlassian. And so because of the scale they are at, they measure everything. And if you can like fine tune just one or two things in the internal developer experience, talking about internally,
Yeah.
you can like drastically change the time to production, right? Like you can drastically change because there's so many people, like
Yeah.
small things actually matter. And so if you're a smaller company, probably not so much, but again, you're setting the foundation for the future. So you have to start thinking about it in the back of your mind. So the answer kind of to your question, I guess, is like if you're a dev tool and you're a startup, like you're focusing on external probably most of the time.
Yeah. And for external, what would you say is sort of like a North Star for measuring success? If this is a good DX or a bad one, should this be product based or should it just be company based? Like, hey,
I
we're,
don't know. I think it depends on
yeah.
who, like how the founding team thinks about it. Like if you are and you can see this in companies, like if the founder, like the companies are usually sort of like a echo of the founders themselves. Like you'll see the type of the personas of the founders in the company, like even from like the website, from the wording, tone of voice, like the way they message things. And so like you'll see, so like I take Super Base again is like they just have like a bunch of memes on social. Like that's their thing. They do that.
Yeah.
Like I don't do that stuff that much because I'm not that guy, but they are, and that's awesome. And it's like very
Yeah.
authentic to them. And so with everything, I think that shows from the founders. So to answer your question, it's like I, as a founder, am very, very interested in making sure things are smooth, they look well, they work well, and all these things. And I think we can do way better. I've had a bunch of compliments. Oh, your website is awesome, your wording, your messaging. And I'm like, wow, I think it's like terrible, right? Like this is actually like not in the sense of terrible, but I think there's so much more work to do, which probably means that I invest a lot in it and my expectations are really high, but their expectations are really low, especially because I think a lot of DevTool founders are really technical for the most part. And that's great for creating
Yeah.
a solution to a problem, but you're
Mhm.
probably at some point going to run into edges. Maybe you won't, maybe you will, depending on your product and market, like that you're missing the softening of these edges to make a better experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. And by the way, your website is fantastic. Whoever is on the design, I think they're doing I think they're doing a fantastic job.
Thank you.
Um,
We're doing our
yeah.
best. The designers I work with probably say they hate me, but yeah, that's
Yeah, I see you're pushing them to care about like every detail because there are a lot of lines. It's easy to miss stuff
yeah.
looking at that. Yeah, but definitely they're doing a great job. But thanks for the answer on what success looks like. Moving on, I started to think about degradation of developer experience, and I think I highlighted this at the start, which is not to say we all, or there's a saying that one of the end states of a product is you live long enough to become Jira, right? As convoluted and with like horrible experience as Jira, or as people say, Jira functions. What's your take on developer experience degradation over time, right? Because at the start you have few features, few APIs. It's great. We can manage that. You could see when stuff breaks. As you grow and add features and you add product sections and you explore new verticals and you sort of have to consolidate all that into like some documentation. Stripe has done a great job, for instance, with their docs and the developer experience around it. But what's your take on managing that?
There's a thesis I'm working on, and I don't think it's locked to developer experience. I think it's like general experience. I think everything degrades with scale or with the target of growing at scale. And so I'll give you sort of like some examples that come to mind. They're not even developer focused. So if you used Uber way back in the day, it
Mhm.
was clean app. You hit a button, a black car that smelled nice with water and candy
Shows.
in it shows up in 2 minutes, hello, and drives you to your place. It was
Yeah.
amazing.
And the rider
Now,
doesn't say anything to you.
yeah,
They just
now, like
drive.
you open the app, you have like ads in the app. Like, I don't know where I'm clicking. I mean, I do, but it's like just annoying that it's showing up. The cars are late, and depending on what city in the world, like again, there's variations between like Croatia or London or New York or San
Yeah.
Francisco and whatever. But like for the vast majority of places, they take like 10 minutes. They cost a lot. They're usually not as clean as they would as they were, and like the people are
Yeah.
annoyed that are inside. They're frustrated because like they're losing so much to the app. It is just like this is terrible. We've gone back to yellow
Yeah.
cap. It's like it's the same thing, right?
You
Except
can
that
order
now you can
food.
like,
You can
yeah,
order food. You can order a
yeah. There's so many,
parcel. You
and so
can-
like,
so many other
and so
things.
I'm picking on Uber right now, which is not fair in that sense. Like, but I feel that everything that we create, especially now in software, like when it's
Hmm.
VC backed and whatnot, like you have the time and financial essentially money capital to go out and create this great experience. It's just awesome, it's perfect and whatever. And then at some point when you get to the capital markets, you IPO whatever, then it's like, oh, like we have to keep growing at the scale. And then you start slightly first, you add way more people, to your point, like it just gets more complex.
Yeah.
You add more features, you're selling more things. It cannot be a simple app because we're doing 100 things right now. And
Hmm.
then on top of that, it's like, oh wait, we still need to squeeze out more profitability. And so we're adding these things or making these
Adding
things
stuff.
worse, or not, or at least not spending capital to make sure someone's doing this thing, right? And
Hmm.
so I've been thinking about this quite a while, is that sort of wave of like you're creating this new thing, it's a great experience, and when it gets to scale, like it's just like it degrades. And I feel
Yeah.
very sad. As a person, feel very sad about that right now. I have to tell you.
I know Daytona will get there, but how do you plan to stop that from happening? Do you think
Yeah.
about it,
So
or you like accepted it?
yeah, there's a lot of things. So some things are not meant to scale. I really do believe that some things are not meant to scale. Some things can
Okay.
be great businesses that have great returns, do a lot of things, and they're not, an IPO company. But to do that, that means that you can't raise, multiple rounds of venture capital because you won't be able to pay that back. So I think there's things that can be quite successful, not in the sense of like the most valuable company in the world, but creates the best experience of whatever. and does that.
Mm-hmm.
But we as a species or civilization are not content with that. And then you start running everything on the growth and projections of numbers. So I don't have a smart answer. I think the answer would be like some things are just great to be at that level. And then
Mm-hmm.
ideally, maybe you have like a private equity that buys these things and then just like has multiple of these things. But the problem with them is that they also do the same thing. They're like, oh, I want to buy 10 companies that do whatever. And then they squeeze out like what they can. So it's more profitable to sell it later
Yeah.
instead of just keeping the profitability where it is. And so, yeah, I don't have a smart answer to that. And the last caveat I have to add before adding that, even if it stays perfect, to your comment earlier, things fizzle out. So if
Mm-hmm.
it stays the same for a decade, probably means that it's worse. It doesn't have to be worse, but the
Okay.
perception is that it is. So I think it's
Yeah.
just this weird world and where we live in where things go up and then go down, and then it gives opportunity for the next one to come up. I guess
Yeah.
that's the way we're programmed. I don't have a better answer for you, unfortunately, right now.
Yeah. And that's cool because I know typically things, if everything around you get better, you just perceived as being worse, even if you didn't change, right? It's like
Yeah.
everything else grew. But that's cool. So one way, at least, I've teams try to, I would say, keep this quality up and just keep developing is to go open source or to be open source, right? And the promise is this open source version is better than like an incumbent existing version. What's your take on that? Building an open source alternative to a large
Yeah.
existing product that's
I'm
bad.
writing an article about this right now. So I don't write that often, and then when there's some things that bug me, I just start and then I write it over the course of a month or 2 months. Like I don't have that much time to do it. Sometimes
Hmm.
it's not actual by the time I write it. But because I'm writing, you try to like actually think about it more and research a bit about it. And one thing I found is that there's a bunch of companies that create a open source version of X, like take whatever incumbent, and say that's their unique selling proposition. Like we're open source. I think that's severely flawed, like absolutely severely flawed. Why? Well, because that if that's going to be a company, that company still has to sell to actually make revenue to actually compete, which means that you're going to go against an incumbent to sell for the most part, probably a lesser product. But your pitch is that it's open source. And so when we talk about open source, and that's why I think people are flawed with that, it's like, what is the point of open source and what is the value of open source? And if you're selling I'm just going to make, so we're using now software for streaming, right? And it's
Hmm.
paid for and we're using it. Like, what is the value of having an open source one? Like, what are you going to do with it? Generally, it's like it's an open source version of this, but the paid one is still cost the same one as this. So why would I take the
Yeah.
open source? Like, what is the incentive to do that? And some people say, oh, it's altruistic because you're then supporting a company that's open source and the code is out in the open. And so one is first like, what does open source even mean? Like, what is the license behind that? And so if it's not Apache or MIT, it's not actually open source. Like there's a lot of restrictions to that. So let's just
Hmm.
remove those out of that, because if there are, that's not even a conversation. But if it's the other
Yeah.
two, it's like, okay, you're Apache or MIT, great. That means like you or I can take that code and embed it in another product, which we can extract value from, or someone else can, or we can actually take your product as is without paying for it. But you'll have to like build
Yeah.
it, run it, host it, and all these things, right? And so I think the value of being open source is that you are creating the value of being open source is that you are providing a solution to someone either as is or
Hmm.
as something they can build upon. Like that's the value to open source. And what you get as a creator of that is the satisfaction and potential clout, or like the recognition that you did these things. And that is the source of open source, because if I open source this, you'll be able to move faster because you don't have to build it, right? That is the point of that.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've found is that companies that are successful build on top of their open source as if it was just someone else's, and then they build value that they charge after that. And that is how you make, I think, open source. And so maybe I have not been clear on that. So I'll take a step back. I think that when you're making something open source, one should actually have an open source license, MIT, Apache. It should provide value as is to a person or persons, and it should have value to be built upon by other
Mm-hmm.
people. And that way you'll get people to build on it and use it and contribute to it and all these things. And that on its own has to give you value. If it doesn't, your plan is flawed, because if you are going to open source value, and what I didn't ask there, the people you're giving value to are users, not buyers.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you are open sourcing value for buyers, then you will run into a problem at some point. Why do I say that? Well, if you are just open sourcing the entire thing, which is a competitor to incumbent, that means that any company can just use it for free and not pay you. And they will, like the vast majority will at some point. And so where is your moat? Like, how do you like, how are you going to
Differentiate.
survive as a company? You cannot.
Yeah.
So what you can open source is value to the user, but not to the buyer. And if you can do that in the sense where you're going to open source value to the user, which users can use and build upon and create a community around that, while not open sourcing value to the buyer, which you will build upon this and generate value from that, that is sort of how you can do that. And so getting back to your original question, when I see a company, it's like, oh, we are X, but we're open source. Like, what does that mean? Why would I, as a buyer, now use that? Like, I don't understand how they think that's going to last in the long term. And so that's my opinion on that. And I'm happy to get yours and dig deeper on that as well.
Well, this is interesting because I see a number of products and they cite because we're open source, we are safer. You can deploy our solution on your cloud, wherever your data remains yours. It's great for EU laws, for instance. It's usually stuff around like data privacy, security, but the core value proposition is that this is open source, even though it's 5, 10, 20 times poorer than the enterprise version. And I'm like, okay, so why don't you sell the data and privacy, I would say value, or the data and privacy modes that you're trying to sell? Say, hey, this is a solution that you can install on your cloud provider. And it does this same thing that this other one does, only you could put this one, you could self-install, self-host this one. So it's pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting to see or to think about that way. But when you go up against folks that are open source, it's sort of like a weird dynamic. You're like, okay, you say it's open source, cheers. I mean, it's open source, right? I can see the code, but it's not MIT licensed. It has like some interesting license that probably will hold you on the shirt if you try to make money out of it. So it's pretty interesting.
And that part is also like and that part is the other part where people don't. And we had this whole affair recently with continue.dev and Pair AI, where Pair AI basically copied, not like forked, but literally copy pasted code from continue dev and put it at its own. And I'm not going to get into details. You can read about it. But what was interesting about that is that people didn't understand. They're like, oh, it's open source, you can do that. Well, no, you cannot. Open source does not mean like you can do whatever the hell you want. It does if it's MIT license. If it's not, you cannot. There's other restrictions there. They were Apache, which means you could do whatever you want, but you still had to say who built it. Like it had to say in the code who built it.
Yeah.
But to your point, is what people are using is like, oh, it's open source, but it's more secure. Well, you can do source available. What is source available? It means that the code is proprietary. but you can see it. Like it's on GitHub. You can download it,
Yeah.
you can run it on your own servers, you can do whatever you want. Like for the security team, it's exactly the same. They can read everything, check it, they can do whatever they want, but it's not open source because there's no point in being open source because you're not going to create a community around building that because no one cares.
Yeah.
No, I would say, I'm not gonna say no one cares, but if it's a large product for enterprises because you're going against its incumbent, it is
Mm-hmm.
probably going to be very hard for individual developers to even run it, look at it. It's a complex system. Like they're not going to contribute to that. So what is the point? The point is if you're going for security, then just make it source available. It's not open source. It's source available. It's there. And you don't confuse people with that, right? You get all the benefits, but
Mm-hmm.
you don't have the risk of actually losing,
Yeah.
not necessarily losing revenue, but 10 years later have to claw back the license, say, oh, we can't be open source anymore because
Mm-hmm.
we're not making enough money. That is a bad look,
No.
right? So like right away, be transparent with what you actually want to do.
Yeah, I think the transparency, that's what's lacking, because a number of folks start out as we're open source, and then over time, they just first start by removing open source from the website and then sending the GitHub repository 3 levels down. So you almost cannot find it. And then they just gradually move to having very limited features open source, and then majority of it is closed source. And I'll confess, I once tried to build, like I saw like a large enterprise product, pretty shitty, a lot of complaints on Trustpilot, and I was like, I think I'm going to build an open source version of this. And I spoke to an engineer that was working with me on it, or that was going to work with me on it, and I'm like, hey, I want to build an open source alternative to this. And he asked me, why open source? And I really didn't have an answer to that. I was like, because there is no open source alternative to it. It's like, are you building it because you want to give people access to this knowledge, or you're just looking for a marketing angle to your shittier product? And I was like, oh, okay. I don't know, because I know it, like inherently, like for me, I just saw an opportunity, but I'll be going against the whale. And the only way to go against the whale is to find something. And I know making it open source, I wouldn't make money from it, right? Because developers that would typically take the product open source, they're not going to buy. They're not paying.
No.
They're not paying for it anyway. And then you're stuck with maintaining it, and you keep the IP out there. So I didn't have like a clear-cut answer to to his question, or at least a meaningful answer to why we shouldn't just, maybe if we're going to build a better version of the existing product. We take something that's super important there, fix it, and it's just another tool out there. Competition is allowed, but if we're going to say something is open source, we have to like come correct and say, yeah, this is truly open source, and this is what it is.
I mean, to be transparent and clear, like if you're gonna do it as a marketing stunt, I actually support that as well. Like people out are trying to find what they're trying to do, but the market will inevitably catch up. Like I don't know, I can't recall, and I can be wrong. Like a company that just did a open source alternative to X and now is like $1 billion company. Like I don't know. I would have to like look at that really, really well. Not saying open source companies are not $1 billion companies. That happens, but like just using the marketing of like being an open source version of X, I don't think it plays out in the long run. And if someone can do that, like kudos to them, like congratulations. I don't hate on that. I just think that you should be very wary if you're the founder of like, oh, I'm going to do that. Similar to your friend, like it might seem like a good, but it's probably not the best idea just to do that. There has to be more reasons than just the marketing, I think, anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Oh shoot, I see we're like way past on time. But yeah, that was great. I think I'm just going to stop there. Stop there with
All right.
with that. Yeah, but this has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks for coming on, Ivan. And we had a bear on the in the chat. I said, don't make it open source for the buyer, but the user.
Yes, exactly.
Yep. That was a good one. Anyways, we've come to the end of today's episode of Everything Outside Code. And thank you so much, Ivan, for coming on. We've had nuggets from great developer experience, documentation. We've heard about the Shift conference, what makes it tick. I didn't know conferences had like 30 to 40% gross margin on them. what makes a great conference continue as well. That's something I'm going to take home with me, and this has been fantastic. Yep. Thank
Thanks.
you also, Barry, in the comments.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah. All right, people. And that's today's episode.